All right, how are we doing tonight? My name is Coach John. If this is your first time tuning in, welcome. Glad to have you with me. And if you're a long timer, great to have you as well. Today we're going to talk about how to get past a plateau. So whenever we start out on a health journey, it's really common to see some rapid results in the beginning. Now, the pace of these results often slows down. In fact, it almost always is going to slow down, and we hit this dreaded plateau. Now, the good news here is that instead of getting discouraged, there are some steps that we can actively take. And really, so my goal in sharing this with you tonight is really that you'll know not just like why a plateau happens, not just some platitudes about how to move past one, but really some practical steps for actually moving past a plateau. And so I'm curious because I always like hearing from people, let's ask this question. How does it feel for you when you hit a plateau in your efforts? Does it feel frustrating? Do you get discouraged? What's it like for you? For me, I think back to about 5 years ago, and I was on this weight loss journey, and I had hired a coach, and for 4 months I wasn't seeing any results, and I was getting really frustrated. And interestingly, I tended to point the blame more towards myself than my coach and the program that I was a part of, and I was getting really frustrated. Like I wanted to quit. But what's really interesting is the following 4 months. So after this 4 month plateau, I got some really amazing results. In fact, I dropped 26 pounds. And when I look back, I realized, well, hang on a sec. That plateau wasn't really a plateau at all. There was a lot of change happening, but it just took time for that to actually be reflected in my physical results. It was like there was a whole lot of change that had to take place under the surface. And so even though I wasn't seeing what I wanted to see reflected in my physical results, it was something that was happening under the surface that led to creating physical results. But this leads to then something kind of interesting, and that is, does it ever feel like your body's fighting against you? Does it ever feel like you're kind of fighting that as you're trying to work through a plateau? I think that's a pretty natural place to get to as well, because you know, I used to feel really combative, like with my own body. Like it was like I was constantly fighting against it. I felt as though like my body, it's almost like my body was conspiring against me to keep me, carrying around extra weight. And it's a really frustrating place to be until I realized actually what's happening in my body. And more importantly, that a plateau is not actually a negative thing. Now that might sound like an interesting thing to say because most people get frustrated, they get mad, they get discouraged. We feel all kinds of emotions around a plateau, but very rarely do we feel like, oh, this is actually a positive thing. So, but let's say, well, what's actually happening when we hit a plateau? So as I mentioned right at the start, when we embark on weight loss, it is really common to see rapid results in the beginning, probably for a number of reasons. But inevitably, those results are going to slow down and maybe even hit a pause. But here's why I think this is interesting, and this is the biggest one, which I think is actually something to be very grateful for. So I want to share this reframe with you. So our body has this amazing ability to adapt. So our body wants to live and our body wants to survive. And so when we embark on weight loss, kind of what we're doing here is we're obviously on the surface, we're making changes to our eating patterns and our activity levels. But from the perspective of our body, we're actually embarking on almost like a mini famine. And our body's goal is to conserve as much energy as possible to keep us alive for as long as possible. And so it's going to adapt, right? It's going to change our metabolism so that we burn slightly fewer calories. And so it's actually responding in this way because this is how we're wired to keep us alive, which I think is really, really fascinating. When we think about this, a plateau, like it's a sign that we need to change some things up. But if we can think about it a little bit differently, what's really happening when we hit a plateau? It's our body adapting to how we are trying to create change and saying, no, because when we think about body fat from a biological perspective, we think like, what is the purpose of body fat? It's not to sort of make us feel uncomfortable or unsightly. It's actually stored energy to help us survive when we don't have enough food. But because for most of us, for anybody watching this, by and large, you probably haven't experienced much of in the way of a famine. And so we never really needed to tap into that. So all we ever see body fat as is an inconvenience, when in truth, what it is a biological mechanism to store calories when we have food abundance to help us survive periods where there isn't food abundance. And I think anybody under the age of 40 probably hasn't seen too much of that. Well, at least if you're watching this. And so then, of course, the real question though here is let's get to it. How can we get past a plateau? And here's the thing, probably the most common advice you're going to get is eat less and move more. Now, On the surface, this seems like helpful advice, right? Eat less, move more, you just keep losing weight. Okay, cool. There's kind of a big chunk of missing context here. And on top of that, this is something that can't be applied forever because you can only reduce food intake so much. Like, what's the bottom limit of that? You can only slash your calories so much. So, what happens when eat less, move more kind of stops working? Because you can also only do so much activity in a day, right? So, there's limits to how effective this can be, which is why it's by itself, it's not particularly useful advice. And so rather than just share kind of maybe standard or expected advice, I want to suggest that we actually look under the surface and see what it is that we might be overlooking here that might be driving a plateau. And of course, whenever I share stuff like this, I always want to encourage you to listen with an open mind and listen for what resonates with you. You might want to jot down a couple of notes, but really, it's not that you have to try to do everything that I share here, but I want to give you some things to think about and go, okay, what's the one that's relevant for me in this situation? So thinking about this, pardon me, how often do you find yourself falling back into old habits? So if you try to create change, maybe you try and embark on weight loss, just as a reflective question, you think about, well, how often do you find yourself falling back into old behavior patterns and old habits? Don't look at it from a place of judgment, a place of I'm a failure or I can't seem to stick with anything or things like that. But just get curious. Does this happen a lot? Because when we're trying to create change, here's what we're trying to do. We're trying to replace old, ingrained, hardwired habits and behavior patterns that have been in our brain for probably many years. So we're trying to change those with new ones. And inevitably, this is going to mean that we're going to fall back into old eating patterns without even realizing it, right? So this idea that because I want to create change, I'm going to totally eliminate an unhelpful behavior pattern that I have just overnight. That's never going to happen. Your eating patterns have been wired into your brain over a number of years, probably. So the idea that I can just change this overnight without ever relapsing to old behavior patterns is basically an impossibility. And so I would say, well, look back over things like your food and your activity records, right? Because, and here's maybe why I think it's valuable in some way to keep track of what you're eating, because our recall is not that great. Our ability to sort of guess what we did in the past isn't that great. And so, pardon me, in one way or another, do look back, keep some kind of track. It could be taking photos of your meals, it could be counting your calories if you want to do that. But in one way or another, keep track of what you're doing because then you have a historical record to look back at and go, okay, what's happening here? Because, okay, when we try to lose weight, our body will adapt by increasing our hunger. So encouraging us to eat more. And it happens without us really realizing. Like our body doesn't give us a signal that says, hey, by the way, I'm going to dial up the hunger hormone called ghrelin to make you eat more. It doesn't tell us it's doing that. It's just what happens. And it happens under the surface. We don't really consciously register this. And so we subconsciously start to eat a little bit more food in response to increasing hunger. And so we could ask, are we slipping back into old habits? Are we subconsciously eating more? You could look at, are you having larger portions, eating maybe more processed foods, kind of getting less movement in? Because it's these on and off type patterns where, let's say, we start to create change, but we kind of relapse into old behavior. Then we try and get back on track and so on. But this sort of on and off pattern can contribute to plateaus. So if you find yourself stuck in a plateau, it's like reassess your habits, your behavior patterns, check your records. What's actually happening here? So the next question I have is, how have you been sleeping lately? And I think this is a really great question to ask because maybe I don't think we appreciate the importance of sleep enough. How many times do we find ourselves staying up too late, watching things or staring at screens or scrolling social media or watching TikTok videos or something like that, right? Um, Check your sleeping patterns. If you find that you're stuck in a plateau, your weight loss seems to have stalled, look at how you're sleeping because trying to create weight loss is a type of stress. Okay. We are biologically inducing stress in our body. We're giving our body less energy that it needs to meet its needs. So that is a biological stressor. So now, if we add in other stressors, in our life, that can mean that our sleep quality starts to decrease. Now, when this happens, it becomes more difficult to regulate our food choices. And on top of that, our metabolism is negatively affected by lack of quality sleep. So if we don't sleep as well, our metabolism gets bumped down a little bit. We don't process carbohydrates quite as well. And so, not getting enough sleep will actually lead to weight gain because number one, it can lower your metabolic rate, but it can also alter hormones that drive appetite. And on top of that, hormones that increase fat storage. So, really, this is probably in one sense, I want to say it's like one of the easiest ones because we're saying get more sleep. Like, but not just get more sleep, not just spend more time in bed, like proactively look at how can I increase the quality of my sleep because I think that's so much more important. And so the next one I want to touch on here is stress. And another reflective question for you is how do you typically handle stress? What is your go-to when you're feeling stressed? How do you deal with it? Now, the interesting thing about stress is very often we normalize it. Yeah, it's stressful, but I can handle it. Okay. But one way or another, like your body is handling it probably different than you might pick up on. And so my question is, do you proactively manage your stress? Because stress itself can really put the brakes on our efforts to lose weight and create change. For example, cortisol, which is sometimes a bit of a boogeyman, but cortisol is known as the stress hormone. And now cortisol is not all bad. We need some, right? Cortisol is a hormone that helps us wake up and go from sleep to being awake. But if we're constantly depending on cortisol just to function, we have a problem. So cortisol can help us adapt to stress. It can help us get through difficult times, but it's not meant to be the thing that we rely on all the time. And interestingly, I think about something like caffeine. I very often refer to caffeine as a credit card, borrowing energy that we don't presently have. And so the problem is that when cortisol is chronically elevated, our body's response to stress, it also increases the likelihood that we're going to store belly fat. And unfortunately, it also seems like this effect is stronger in women. I'm sorry, women, but I didn't play the biological card, but that's what we seem to notice. And so producing too much cortisol can really make weight loss very difficult. And so it might seem like, like, look, there's a lot going on in the world today. There's a lot to be distressed about. There's a lot to be worried about, to be frustrated, to be anxious about. And it might feel like we have very little control over the stress in our life. But what the research actually shows is that if we can learn to proactively manage our stress, it actively promotes weight loss. And I'll just cite one quick study as an example here. In an 8-week program that was really focused actually on stress management, so focused on muscle relaxation and deep breathing, it led to a weight loss of nearly 10 pounds. So they weren't even focusing on weight loss, but as they started to help people manage their stress over the period of 8 weeks, the average weight loss in that study group was 10 pounds just by learning how to manage stress. Now, isn't that fascinating? So when you think about that, you go, hmm, maybe this is something I should pay a little bit closer attention to. This idea, instead of just normalizing stress, trying to tough it out, trying to say, yeah, I got this, or I know what I'm doing, I know how to handle this, it's just my normal, and so on. It's like, can you proactively manage your stress? So next thought I want to touch on here is this thought of discouragement. And the question I have is how do you respond to discouragement? Because I think another piece of advice that we very often get, um, if we say to someone like, "Hey, my weight loss is stalled, or I'm feeling stuck, or whatever," we hear this advice like, "Don't be discouraged." Okay, that by itself isn't particularly helpful because it doesn't really point us to anything we could do. Right? Don't be discouraged says don't do this thing, but it doesn't really point us to something to actually do. So I think it's helpful for us to look at how discouragement sets in. So where does discouragement typically come from? And my thought on it is this. Discouragement sets in when our expectations don't match up with our lived reality, right? So when we have a certain expectation, let's say we embark on a weight loss program and we have this expectation that everything's going to go well because we've embarked on this program. I'm going to lose weight 1 to 2 pounds a week, like clockwork every week. The weight's going to go down and so on. And I'm going to get to the end of this and everything's just going to be amazing. And when we try to do this in real life, these expectations they bump into reality where, oh, this is hard. Trying to create change is challenging. It's difficult. There are disruptions. Life is unpredictable and so on. And so discouragement sets in if we don't expect this is going to happen. And so maybe it's also helpful to look at how our expectations have been shaped, especially from like popular culture, whether it's social media. Like, have you ever watched extreme weight loss shows like what's that one called? The Biggest Loser. You know, most of the time, what we actually see in media like this, in shows like this, or in social media is not an accurate reflection of reality. And so we want to think about, have my expectations been distorted? And this happens without us even realizing it, right? But we start to think about, what am I consuming in terms of TV shows and media and things like that, and how is it making me feel about myself, and is it distorting my expectations? So if we go into a weight loss journey with unrealistic expectations, it's a very good chance we're going to end up feeling discouraged when we hit a plateau, because it's a normal part of the process, right? And then when we hit discouragement, very often the response is, I'm going to quit. I'm going to give up because this sucks. This doesn't work. I'm stuck. I don't want to keep struggling and feeling like I'm not getting anything for my effort. Like it sucks to feel like I'm putting in all this effort and then not see the results. So what helps to reshape our expectations, because remember, discouragement comes from unmet expectations, from expectations that don't line up with our lived reality, right? So what we want to understand is, what does normal look like? And it's going to be different for most people, but there's definitely some common features. And one of the things that's super common is you're going to hit a plateau, and you're probably going to relapse into old behavior patterns. Those two things are a part of just about anyone's journey of weight loss. You'll hit a plateau and you'll probably relapse into old behavior patterns, and has really not a lot to do with you as a human being and your moral character, and a lot more to do with how your brain works. So when you understand this, you're less likely to get discouraged. When you understand that relapses, for example, that they're a natural part of this process, falling back into old behavior patterns that have been there for many years, that's going to happen because they're familiar, they're common. And so when we know that this is a part of the process, we're a lot less likely to get discouraged. So we've been talking about weight, excuse me, we've been talking about weight loss. I get a little excited and then I start to lose my voice. What other ways do you track progress beside the scale? That's something to think about, because we do put a lot of stock in the scale. I think weight loss is a beneficial thing to pursue, right? Weight loss is beneficial for almost everybody's health. The pendulum has swung maybe a little bit too far, in my opinion at least. The pendulum has swung a little bit too far when it comes to things like health at every size and body positivity. These started out as well-intentioned things, but I think, and this is a bit of a sidebar from what I'm talking about with a scale here, but I think something that was well-intentioned like this got a little bit misdirected and got us afraid to talk about weight loss, when in fact weight loss is a valuable, it's a beneficial thing for most people to pursue. However, I think what it gets right is, we don't necessarily want to tie our sense of human worth to a number on the scale. Ultimately, we don't want to assess our value as a human being according to a number on the scale, right? And then in the process of weight loss, if we know that in this process we're going to hit plateaus, maybe even have relapses, have a little bit of weight regain from time to time, we can think about, okay, what are some other ways that I can look at progress in, like, my efforts to create change? So maybe it's the way we feel. Maybe it's being able to work out a little bit longer, a little bit harder, simply fitting into some clothes you couldn't fit in before, looking a little better. These are all reasons to celebrate that have nothing to do with a number on the scale, right? So remember, weight loss itself is even really just a proxy goal. What do I mean by that? I mean that weight loss is not the ultimate goal. Really, we pursue something like weight loss because of what it allows us to be able to do. And I'd really encourage you to think about this. What are you really looking for? If your goal is to lose weight, why? What is this really about for you? Is it really about a number on the scale, or what does that number on the scale represent for you? If you hit that number, what can you do there that maybe you can't do now? What ability would you like to gain? So ultimately, it's understanding that weight loss itself is not it's a means to an end. It's not the end in and of itself. So reflect on, what does this actually mean for me? And the last thing I wanted to think about is, from what I shared here, what's actually most helpful for you right now? So I've shared a few things that I want you to kind of, I'm encouraging you to reflect on. But from this, is there one thing that you could take away and do something about? So we talked about reassess your habits. So are you slipping into old behavior patterns? So very commonly, when we start to hit a plateau, a part of it is actually just slipping into old behavior patterns, where maybe we're unconsciously eating a little bit more. They're called like habits for a reason, because we don't really think about it. We don't really consciously pick up on it, but it's very often happening. Check your sleeping patterns. Sleep can have a significant effect on our ability to lose weight, and if we're not getting enough of it, it's going to make a difference. Proactively manage your stress. So modern life is inherently stressful, and it's probably in one sense only going to get more stressful. we can't just expect it to sort of fade away to nothing. We really need to proactively manage our stress. Reevaluate your expectations. So look at, if I was going into this process, because discouragement often makes us want to quit and fall into old behavior patterns and just go eat comfort food. So look at our expectations. What was I expecting when I embarked on this process? Was I expecting everything to go perfectly? Was I expecting there wouldn't be a relapse? Was I expecting, you know, and say, what do I need to reevaluate about this? And maybe understand that relapses are normal, that plateaus are normal, that struggling is normal. It's all a part of the process. Uncomfortable emotions are going to be a part of the process. This isn't going to be this perfectly seamless thing. So when we go into it with this understanding that, hey, this is going to be a little bit difficult and it's going to challenge me and it's going to be uncomfortable, but that's a part of the process. Okay, when this happens, I don't get discouraged because I realize this is actually a part of the process. And then number five was really look beyond the scale, right? So while weight loss is a good and a beneficial goal to pursue, we don't necessarily need to make it the only one that we have, right? And so ultimately, my hope in kind of sharing this with you is really to help you to be inspired and to be encouraged as you can actually see how it's possible to move past plateaus and really build like a lasting healthy lifestyle. Beyond that, to go past the advice of eat less, move more, and say let's look at a few other factors here because if you're, well, let's just say there's probably a few things that we didn't consider. And I hope that now, after sharing this with you, that you're more likely to consider. So, I very much appreciate you tuning in. Hopefully, you found this valuable and look forward to seeing you next time.